Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. So speaking of technology, I think I'm going to need some technology advice to be explained to me so easily that my grandma can understand it, because it really kicked my butt this week, let me tell you guys. Thankfully, we talked so the irony here is last episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, we talked about the importance of backups and how you should always keep backups of stuff. Well, that came in really handy this week, for sure. But before that, another way technology was kicking my butt was I have an old Apple Xserve, which, if you're unfamiliar with what that is, back in the early 2000s, Apple used to make rack-mounted servers for enterprise use. Sounds crazy, but they actually did. You can find them on eBay. Honestly, for what the performance you get out of them, the pricing on them is kind of terrible. Just being real with you. But at the same time, it's kind of like a cool piece of history, especially if like you're into Apple products and stuff. Having like this rack-mounted server from Apple is pretty cool that can run Mac OS. So it's kind of cool. But the reason I bring that up was I was trying to fiddle with it again, trying to see if I could get like the remote management software working. And because I'm talking about this, you probably already know that it didn't work. And I think part of that problem is I'm currently running it with OpenCore Legacy Patcher, so I can run the latest version of macOS Monterey on it. Because normally I think that the Xserve that I have, I think honestly only supports up to like macOS Lion, I think, which is macOS like 10.7 or something, and we got up to 10.15, I believe, before we switched over to 11 and then 12, so it's pretty old. So I think part of the reason why I wasn't able to get it to work was because obviously no supported Mac nowadays can even use this, remote management thing, the IPMI, which is, the way that you can connect to a server and kind of do like some remote management stuff, like shut it down, turn it on, get metric data from it, see what the fan speed's at, see what the temperatures are, that kind of stuff. And some companies like Intel and HP and Dell, they have their own custom software that integrates with the IPMI and can give you a web interface so you can, better see those kinds of stats rather than having to query a command line argument, to get those kinds of stats. So, but as far as I know, I don't believe the Xserve had that capability at all. It did have what they called the lights out management, which was just the IPMI that you could configure, but that was only in older versions of Mac OS. So my plan, I don't know how many tries we're on. We're on at least attempt number 3, if not 4, maybe even 5. I don't know. I've lost track. I go in spurts with this, right? Like, I'll try to get it to work. It doesn't work. Then I'll, shelve the project for a few weeks or a few months or however long it is. And then, for whatever reason, I'll get the urge again to try it again. So then I'll try it again. It doesn't work. And then, so I'm sure you all have had projects or things where you kind of go through those cycles, right? Where you try to work on it. It doesn't really go how you want, so you try to shelve it, maybe the time away will do you some good, and then you come back to it with, maybe some fresh ideas, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I don't exactly know how many times I've tried, but I know it's been at least multiple. But my next attempt that I'm planning on trying is I do have an old CD that came when I bought the server of Lion. So what I'm thinking of doing is trying to install Lion again, and I managed to find a copy of the server admin tools for Lion. So I'm thinking if I can install Lion on there, install the server admin tools, then I should be able to configure the IPMI through that. And then it's just a matter of, if I configure it, if I then upgrade to a new version of macOS, like go back to my Monterey install, will the IPMI still work? And that's obviously yet to be seen. I have no idea if it's going to work. It might just not. But, we'll see. I mean, honestly, the IPMI isn't that big of a deal, because my server rack sits in the same room that my office is in, because my house is kind of small and I don't have a good place to put the rack, which is big sad for sure. But because of that, I don't know why, but the Xserve is just, it's loud as heck. Even if it's not even turned on, just the power supplies are plugged in, it's honestly louder than all my other servers just running, doing their normal tasks, which is kind of insane. I don't know why those power supplies are so loud, but it is what it is. And then when the thing's on, it sounds like a jet engine taking off, because what it does is when you first power it on, it's like, oh, I was powered off. Let me make sure that my fans still work. So then it decides to ramp its fans all the way up to the max that it can go, before slowly bringing them down to quote-unquote idle, which is still way louder than anything else in my rack. And I kid you not, I can be in the farthest place in my house away from that server with the door closed. So downstairs, I go to my half bathroom, close the door, and when that server's going ham, I can still hear it all the way down there with the door closed. That's how loud this thing is. So I generally only turn it on if I want to tinker with it or need to use it for something, and then as soon as I'm done, it gets shut off and I pull the cords on it, because it's just way too dang loud. Ideally, in the ideal scenario, I would obviously have a place where my rack can exist, where it won't overheat and be hot, but I don't have to hear it at all, unless I actually want to be in the room with it so I can work on my servers. That is the ideal solution, but I don't know when I will get to have that solution, so for the meantime, it is just going to stay off until that happens. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about, I mentioned in the last episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the importance of backups and backing up your data. So, if you weren't aware and didn't know already, whenever you decide to upgrade your operating system, always make sure you back up your data first, because while it doesn't always happen, and generally nowadays at least it's pretty rare that somehow the update's going to brick your machine, I decided to update my servers that I run, update all the VMs and all the services that I run. And most of them, things went off without a hitch. Upgrade worked good. I upgraded from Ubuntu 20.04, the LTS version, to they recently released the 22.04 LTS version, which is the long-term support version. So rather than their normal releases that you get, I think 9 to 12 months of software support, the long-term release versions you get, I don't remember how much it is. It's at least 4 or 5 years of support. And then I think you can even get security updates after that. So it's definitely a more stable version and kind of the way you want to go, especially if you're running Ubuntu on a server. So I decided to upgrade to the new version 22.04. And most of my VMs, like I mentioned, no problem. Upgraded just fine. Had no issues. but I had two that they did not like the update. They did not like it at all. So the first one was my VPN server, which is obviously a problem if that thing's not working, because that's how I can connect back to my home network from anywhere and be able to manage things. So if that's not going to work, then I can't actually manage things remotely, and we have a problem. And then the other one that broke was my VM where I host all my Docker containers for my local, for my home network here, which that's not as big of a deal, but some of the Docker containers I run is like Grafana dashboards. So if you're unfamiliar, Grafana is basically a web interface that can allow you to display dashboards of various metrics. So for example, I have metrics displaying, well, I did. Currently, actually, as a matter of fact, at the recording of this podcast, I'm currently restoring that virtual machine to hopefully get it back online. But what that dashboard did was, display things like my current internet speeds, to see what my uploads, what my downloads are, what my pings are, latency, that kind of thing. Then I also had it, going back to the IPMI stuff, I had it pulling IPMI metric data like I talked about. You can use IPMI to pull different things like your fan speed, temperatures, that kind of thing, power draw. So I was using that to pull data from my Dell servers that have IPMI capabilities, and be able to pull that into a dashboard and get to see, all the metrics there in one place. So that was the point of that. So not having it wouldn't necessarily be a huge deal, but it's one of those nice to haves. So going back to the Xserve, it would be cool if I could get IPMI working there and be able to pull that data in as well. But until I can get it working, I really can't do that. But see, the thing is, I made sure, because this part here is actually going to be a great segue into the main topic of this podcast, which is talking about DevOps. But the reason I bring this up about the importance of backups was because before I upgraded my servers, I use Proxmox, which is my hypervisor that I run on my machines, so I can run a bunch of virtual machines on them. So Proxmox has this ability where you can do a batch backup job, where you can basically create a job and back up all your virtual machines. So that's what I did. I backed up all my virtual machines to my NAS. My network attached storage, which we talked about in the last episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. So honestly, if you haven't listened to the last episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, you really should, because there's a lot of tie-ins to this one, which is honestly not intentional at all. That's just how the cookie crumbles, as they say. But so I backed up all my virtual machines to the NAS just in case something went wrong. And I am glad I did, because something went wrong. So obviously my VPN server not working and my Docker containers not working. So what I did was I backed them all up, and then getting into the DevOps side of things, I used an Ansible script, or an Ansible playbook rather, to basically perform the upgrade from Ubuntu 22.04 or 20.04 to 22.04 rather. So I wrote an Ansible playbook to do that upgrade, and for testing purposes, I just tested on one virtual machine, tested the playbook on one machine. Everything worked fine, so I was like, all right, everything worked, so let's go on and do it for all of them. So I ran the playbook. It obviously took a while, because upgrading an operating system isn't necessarily a fast process, but it finally finished, and I was actually away from my house at the time, and I was trying to connect back into my network to check on the status of everything, and I noticed my VPN wasn't working, and I was like, uh-oh, this isn't good. So I got back home, And I look and, everything looks like it's up and running. Like all the VMs say that they're on. And I'm like, okay, that's weird. So and then I try to connect to the VPN again, and it didn't work. Try to connect to the web interface, didn't work. And I was like, all right, well, since this isn't working, I'm just going to restore from the backup, since I made a backup of the virtual machine before I upgraded it. So I just rolled it back to the older version, and the VPN worked again. How about that? So then I decided, okay, well, maybe it was this problem with the automated install process. So I'll just try to manually install it and see if that works. So I tried manually installing it, and I ran into the same issue. Once the new version was installed, the VPN still didn't work. So I think it probably has something to do with the OpenVPN software that I'm running, having like either a compatibility issue or the packages aren't included in the newer version of Ubuntu or something like that. But anyway, it doesn't work in the new version yet, so I'm holding it back at 2204 for the time being, which isn't a problem by any means, because 2204 is still supported because it's, the long-term support. It's still getting updates, still getting security patches, so it's not that big of a deal. And then the same thing with the Docker container virtual machine. As I mentioned, it's currently in the process of being restored now. I did try to salvage that because I didn't want to roll that back, but I basically had no luck in trying to restore that those Docker containers that weren't working. But speaking of Docker containers and Ansible, that is a fantastic segue into the main thing that I wanted to talk about in this podcast episode, which is the concept of DevOps. Now, a lot of places, when they talk about DevOps, are kind of just using it as a buzzword, and that's kind of what it's turned into at this point. It's just kind of a buzzword. But what we want to do in this episode is go beyond the buzzword. What actually is DevOps? So when you ask someone what is DevOps, if they give you the name of a tool, they're wrong. I understand where they're coming from, because in DevOps, people use a lot of various tools. Like people use Ansible, for example. Some people use Jenkins. Some people use GitLab. There's a ton of different tools out there that you can use to help in the DevOps process. But that's the key word there, the DevOps process. It's a process. It's not a tool. So the idea of DevOps is this idea of CI/CD pipelines, which CI/CD just means continuous integration and continuous deployment. So before the DevOps mentality was invoked, basically what you would have was you'd have two different teams. You would have the dev team and you would have the ops team, or the developers and the operations people. So the point of the developers was pretty obvious. They would write the code, do the development of the software, and then they would throw it over the fence, as it were, is what they would call it, over to the operations side of the people, and they would be in charge of actually deploying that software. And then if there were any issues that the software ran into when it was deploying, or on the deployment side, like there was a bug or there was an issue with the program crashing or whatever, the ops people would throw it back over the fence to the dev people. They'd fix it up, throw it back over to the ops people, and they would redeploy it. So as you might be able to gather, it's not necessarily the most efficient process out there. And then you also run into the problem of the ops team you might have some people that have like a general idea of how code works, but they're not developers. And I've had to deal with people that aren't developers, like writing code and fixing code, and let me just say, it is not a pretty sight at all. So the ops team, if they don't know how to fix the problem, they have to throw it back to the dev people, And, that's just a whole extra step there of things. So the idea of the DevOps process is to essentially combine those into one thing. So your people are familiar with both the development and the deployment process, and basically familiar with the entire life cycle of the actual development and deployment process, rather than only being knowledgeable of the development process or only being knowledgeable of the operations process. So the idea of the CI/CD pipelines is you would essentially, so if I'm the developer, what I would do is I would write my code, and then I would say push it to my repository, and then that would kick off the CI/CD pipeline that once push was made, or you might have it set up where once a pull request is made, or whatever you have set up and configured. Whenever something happens, that'll trigger the pipeline to go off, and what that'll do is that can do a range of things, but the most simple thing is it'll start, run a bunch of test cases on your code. So that's where you want to have, good test cases written so you can catch any errors or bugs or anything like that before it even gets pushed to production. So in that case, if you run it through your test cases and it fails, it just kills the pipeline there, sends the report back to the developers, be like, hey, you failed X, Y, and Z test cases, and that's why the pipeline failed. So the developer can take that back, fix those up, re-push the code, it'll kick off the pipeline again, and then it'll go through all those test cases. If those pass, then you get into, say you're deploying Docker containers, right? So if you made code changes, you're obviously going to have to make a new Docker container. So once you passed your test cases, it'll go on to creating the Docker container. And then once the Docker container's made, say you're using Kubernetes to deploy and manage those Docker containers. So then once the Docker container's made, you use Kubernetes to go and deploy those Docker containers out to, say, your AWS instance or your Azure instance, or wherever you deploy your containers to, and that's your pipeline. And just all you had to do was push the code, and within a matter of seconds or minutes or however long it takes to run all those steps, your code's deployed. Simple as that. No middleman, no throwing code back over the fence to each other. Easy. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to it than that. It's not, quite as simple. And that's where, the tools come in that everyone talks about. And when people say, oh, this is DevOps, that's kind of where that comes from. So in a way, yeah, they're kind of right. Sure, you can use, say, a Jenkins, to do those pipelines for DevOps, but Jenkins isn't DevOps. It's just a tool. DevOps is a process. So if you're familiar with the agile development process, DevOps kind of fits in really nicely into agile. And basically what agile is rather than the waterfall approach, which the waterfall approach was essentially you take your requirements, you do your development, you do your testing, you do your deployment, and then after you deploy, that's when you actually gather feedback, and then you go back up to the top, and it kind of trickles down. So you can think of waterfall, back in ye olden days, when you would get your programs on CDs. You obviously can't do any kind of continuous testing and deployments and getting feedback from customers or anything like that, because you're actually deploying media. And as far as CDs, it's not an over-the-air software update, or you're pushing a change to a website or something like that. It's nothing like that. So Agile is pretty much okay, so it takes this idea, it uses the idea of what's called sprints. So sprints are essentially usually 2 weeks, although it can range from 2 to 4 weeks. 4 weeks is really pushing it, though. But basically, you have a 2-week process where you take a bunch of tasks off your, to-do list, essentially, and you implement those. And then after you implement those, then you would do your, push the code, do the, the pipeline, all that good stuff. And then you could gather feedback, and you'd have, what they call like daily scrum meetings, where you kind of go over, this is what I'm working on, this is what I'm having issues with. I could, maybe ask people for help there. And so some people hate scrum meetings, which I understand, like, it's just another meeting and everyone hates meetings, but usually, from my experience, they're generally pretty quick for the most part, because if you're meeting every single day, there's not necessarily a ton to update, because everyone knows what you did the past couple days, so you don't have to update them on a weeks or months worth of work or whatever. You can just update them on, like, yeah, this is what I did already today, this is what I'm planning on doing, I'm having trouble with this, anyone have any ideas or can help me out, that's pretty much it. So kind of that constant feedback loop can be beneficial. Now, obviously, it has its downsides, just like any, development process has its downsides. But the goal of, the Agile and DevOps is to kind of automate things and, kind of get that constant integration and feedback, and basically kind of loop on itself, so everything can kind of like build and you can make better products. So personally, I don't necessarily use a ton of DevOps stuff in my personal, projects, mainly because I don't really have a need to. Like, I'm not, deploying a sub module of a website to, 30 different servers so it can be load balanced for my company or whatever, right? Like that, I don't do that. So setting up, a cluster of a ton of, say Kubernetes hosts or virtual machines or whatever, and deploying, running it through a pipeline and deploying to a bunch of different things. It's just not really practical for me personally. Now, obviously, if I worked for a bigger company, then it would make a lot of sense, to do something like that and, really get involved. But what have I done as far as DevOps? Well, as I kind of mentioned, using Ansible to really automate, the process of managing my infrastructure here at my house. As I mentioned, I wrote an Ansible playbook to automate the upgrading process of my servers, which 2 of them kind of backfired on me a little bit, but because I had backups, I was okay. But in addition to that, I also have other playbooks to like do other things, like update my Pi holes, restart VMs, just do regular system updates rather than like system upgrades, like from one release to another. Just, check for updates. If there are updates, update the system, restart if needed, that kind of thing. But probably the biggest thing DevOps wise that I've done was I made, well, I guess technically 3 playbooks, but they're all basically the same. So I'm currently trying to write a cross-platform game right now, and I'm writing it in C++, mainly as a personal project for personal development, to improve my skills with C++ and, working with memory and that kind of stuff, which is the great thing about personal projects. I mentioned this in a previous episode, how personal projects can be really powerful and kind of help you to learn new things. But basically what the playbook does was it basically takes all the source code from the project, and it will deploy it to, whatever host I'm trying to build for. So for example, if I want to build a Windows version of the game, I can deploy it to my Windows development environment that I have set up, and then it'll ship the code off to there. It'll, unzip it, build the code, and then structure the code so it can be run right away. And what I mean by that is basically I ship off not only the source code, but also like the library files it needs and like any kind of like images or other resources that it needs to be able to run. So once the code is built and the executable is made, you don't necessarily have a finished product there, because if you run the executable, it needs other things, right? It needs, libraries, or it needs images so it can actually pull the data in, so you actually have, a working game and not just a black screen. So you have to kind of format the directory structure correctly in order for the game to work. So then what the script does is, after it builds the executable, it makes that directory structure, puts everything where it's supposed to be, zips that up, sends it back to my machine, and then cleans up the workspace so I don't have a bunch of a bunch of files on the system, and makes it nice and clean. So then it's the same thing if I want to build on Linux. Same exact process. Send off the source code and all those extra resource files that it needs to make the game, unpacks them, builds the executable, creates the directory structure, zips that all up, sends it back to my machine, cleans up the workspace, good to go. And then same exact story for Mac OS as well. And the reason why I did that was because I wanted to try to make this as universal as possible. So sure, I could have only made, since personally I do most of almost all of my development work on a Mac. So Linux and PC fanboys, feel free to hate on me, but that's what it is. But I should point out, for all you Linux fanboys out there, which statistically probably aren't many, because the market share of Linux is very small. But I did, when we did our operating systems showdown, which was a couple episodes back, Linux did win, spoiler alert. So even though I use a Mac as my daily driver, I did give Linux the win as the best operating system in that showdown. So just got to throw that out there. But the reason why I made 3 different playbooks for Windows, macOS, and Linux was so if, say, in the future down the line, I want to get other developers involved, and say they're developing on Windows or they're developing on Linux, they could still be able to deploy to what the other 2 operating systems, and actually get working executables from that. So they wouldn't have to have separate machines that they have to manually copy the code to and build it. So for example, since I'm using a Mac, right, what I don't want is one of another developer, if I would ever bring another developer onto this project, to have to take their code, and because I didn't make an Ansible playbook for Mac OS, have to actually get a Mac and copy the code over to the Mac and then build it, create the directory structure and everything, which actually for a Mac it's a little bit different, since you actually have to create a .app file, which essentially is the same thing, just a directory structure. So the kind of off topic here, but if you're on a Mac and you have an app and you can right click on it and show package contents, it's really just a folder structure disguised to look like an application, which is kind of cool if you didn't know about that fun fact, I guess. So having to go through that process is just kind of a pain. And that's honestly the reason I made the playbooks in the first place, because when I was developing this and I wanted to make it cross-platform, it was such a pain to have to copy all the files over to my various development environments, run the make file to build everything, and then copy everything where it needs to go in the directory structure, zip that up, and send it back over to me. And it sounds like a long process, right? Because it is. It was kind of a pain and annoying. So I was like, I need a way to automate this. I need a CI/CD pipeline. I need DevOps, right? So that's basically how I use it. So I wrote the playbook. At first, I believe at first I just did it for Linux because I hadn't had any experience using Ansible with Windows, which again, personal projects, great way for a learning experience. learned how to do stuff with Windows in Ansible. So that was really cool. But yeah, I started off with Linux and, got it working where I could, run the Ansible playbook, and it would automatically ship off my code, build it, package it how it needs to work, ship it back to me. And I have tested multiple times. I can take that tar.gz file, which is basically just a different way of compressing data down like a zip file, and I can throw that on any Intel or x86 based Linux machine, and all I have to do is run the executable and works just fine. Same thing with Windows and Mac OS. I can just build it on my development environment for the given operating system with the Ansible playbook. Don't have to worry about copying anything. I can just run the playbook and everything's done for me. So it's definitely a great quality of life improvement. Saves me a ton of time. And that's kind of really the point of, kind of circling back to DevOps. Really at the crux of what DevOps is, that's kind of the point. Automating things, making your life easier, cutting out middlemen, and removing all those extra steps that you would otherwise manually have to do, finding ways to automate that, whether that's through Ansible, whether that's through a Python script, whether that's through a different tool like through Jenkins, or whether you're running that on, say, GitLab through CI/CD pipelines or runners, or whatever your CI/CD pipeline looks like. That's really the point, is just to be able to speed things up, make things go quicker, and make your life a heck of a lot easier. Honestly, when I was thinking about topics for this podcast, and I kind of really got thinking about Ansible again, mainly I think when I made that playbook to upgrade on my Ubuntu servers from 20.04 to 22.04, it just really made me think, like, man, this is such a great automation tool. And I know on a previous episode I mentioned how great Ansible is and automation and all that stuff, but man, is it awesome. And that kind of got me thinking, DevOps. People use Ansible and DevOps to, manage wide varieties of servers. And, personally at my job right now, my day job, I don't use Ansible at all. And really, before I really got into, having a home lab and all that stuff, I think I touched Ansible a tiny bit at an internship I had, and I really didn't understand it and really grasp how powerful it really is. And then I got a home lab set up, and I was like, having to manually SSH into all of these different servers to update them is a real drag. I remember there was a tool out there called Ansible that could be used for that. I'm going to look into it. And, this is how, either having a home lab or doing personal projects like this can really, even if your job, doesn't, have you use technologies like this, you can create your own projects to, learn these technologies and, get acclimated to them. So makes you more valuable in your career, or if you want to switch careers, it can help with that too. And another thing that I've been, really trying to get into, which is another thing that's used in DevOps quite a bit, is Docker containers. I hadn't touched Docker containers at all. I always thought they were cool, but I never really, got into them. But over the past week or so, I've been really trying to get into them. And like I mentioned, the Grafana dashboard that I have, all of that's running in Docker containers. And then recently I had the task of pulling the IPMI metrics. All that was done with Docker containers, and trying to figure out how that works and how Docker works, and building a custom Docker file and configuring that. And that was just a great learning experience. and honestly kind of fun. And now I'm at the point where I'm like, man, what else can I do with Docker? What other containers can I run in? It's really a rabbit hole. I tell you what, guys, once you go down this technology rabbit hole and really start diving into these technology concepts and various technologies, honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if in like a matter of months or something, I find like one small minor project I could do with, say, Kubernetes, and like I'm hooked on it, and I'm like, I need to find another project that I can use Kubernetes on, because currently as it stands right now, I haven't found a use for, as much as I want to get into Kubernetes and learn about Kubernetes, I really don't have like a project or anything in mind that I can think of that would be valuable, right? Like Docker containers, sure, you don't necessarily have to deploy a ton of them, right? You could just deploy a couple of them, just deploy one, or you could just create one. You don't have to necessarily worry about that. Where Kubernetes is definitely more of like a larger scale type thing. Now, obviously, you don't have to do it that way, but I mean, if you're just doing like Kubernetes to deploy one thing, I mean, it's not much different than just, doing it with Docker, or like writing a Docker compose file or something like that. Which I guess I guess I'll mention briefly. Docker compose is essentially the way that you can create multiple Docker instances at once, rather than having to write separate Docker commands for every container that you want to spin up. You can essentially write one Docker compose file is what it's called. You write one file and you input all the configuration data you want. Like, I want to use this Docker container and I want to have it listening on this port, and I want it to be able to connect with this network, and you can configure all the data that you want in there. And then all you have to do is just Docker compose up, and all the containers that you have listed in that Docker compose file brings them all up, starts them all up, and you're good to go. And then if you want to shut them down, you just Docker compose down and shuts them all down. So another really great automation tool for DevOps for sure. So if you get anything out of this episode, the biggest thing to know is that DevOps is more than a buzzword. It's not a tool, it's a process. So if you have a good process in place and you have good people working that process, it really doesn't matter what tools you use, because at the end of the day, DevOps is a process. And that's the thing. If you're going to take anything away from this episode, that's what I want you to take away. So if you enjoyed this episode, I ask that you leave a rating and review and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. Also, be sure to share with a friend or family member who you think would be interested in learning about DevOps and automation and going behind just the buzzword of DevOps and all that good stuff. If you have any questions about this episode, or if you have any questions you want me to answer in a future episode, leave your question in a rating and review, or you can email me your question at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. You can click the link in the show notes below for that. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bool nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.